Thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Woods, Director of the Oriental Institute. I'd like to welcome you to this members lecture. I'd like to extend special thanks to our members, without whose support this program would not be possible. And for those of you who are not members, we certainly hope you'll consider supporting us. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Michael Harrower, who is Associate Professor of Archaeology and Director of SOLAR, the Spatial Observation Lab for Archaeological Research at Johns Hopkins University. Michael's research on the long-term histories of civilizations in Africa and Arabia has a focus on water histories and water dynamics, as well as ancient trade. He is also a specialist in GIS and satellite imagery mapping. His recent publications include Water Histories in Spatial Archaeology, Ancient Yemen and the American West, and Landscape History of Hadramaut, The Roots of Agriculture in Southern Arabia Project, 1998 to 2008, which he edited with Joy McCorriston. Michael has conducted fieldwork in Oman and Ethiopia. His fieldwork in Oman includes a wide-ranging archaeological survey along with satellite imagery mapping of copper and chlorite or soft stone resources, production and trade networks. Today, however, Michael will be speaking about his recent fieldwork in Ethiopia, where he directs the excavations at Beta Samati. This recently discovered settlement was part of the empire or kingdom of Aksum, which ruled over the region from approximately 80 BCE to 825 CE and was a major power along the great trade networks that crossed the ancient world from the Mediterranean to the Far East. Please join me in welcoming Michael, who will present Finding an Ancient Town, Discovery and Excavation of Beta Samati, Ethiopia. We hope you will enjoy this online OI members lecture.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here to present for the University of Chicago Oriental Institute on the archaeology of Ethiopia and our discovery of the ancient town of Beta Samati. It's really an honor to be asked to present to this audience, given that the Oriental Institute is really one of the premier centers around the world for the study of the ancient Near East and indeed for the study of the ancient world in general. So I'm very pleased to give you some highlights of our recent collaborative explorations and investigations in Ethiopia. So it's important to note that our work in Ethiopia is really part of a large collaborative effort, the Southern Red Sea Archaeological Histories project that I started in 2009 and benefits from the support of a range of institutions, many of which are shown here, as well as scholars in Ethiopia from Aksum University, the Authority for Research and Conservation of Cultural Heritage, the Tigray Cultural and Tourism Bureau, and as well as a great number of local peoples who were so gracious and so hospitable in helping make this work possible. I'm going to focus in today to give you a bit of a background on the archaeology of Ethiopia and pre-Aksumite and Aksumite civilizations, and really specifically examine the discovery of the ancient town of Beta Samati and our excavations at this important site as depicted in this image. This map gives you a sense of the study area in northern Ethiopia. So we know that the center of Aksumite civilization was the modern and ancient city of Aksum in highland Ethiopia near the border of Eritrea, and that this civilization expanded its reach into the Arabian Peninsula, up into Sudan, and at its apex was one of the most powerful civilizations of this period of time through the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD. This map shows you some of the study areas of projects. So I'll be talking today about SRSAH, the Southern Red Sea Archaeological Histories project shown in orange. There was also important survey work done by Joseph Michaels of Penn State University between Aksum and Yeha in 1974, as well as a number of other projects, a more recent project around Shire led by UCLA's Vilka Vendrick, a World Bank survey around Aksum, the Eastern Tigray Archaeological Project led by Catherine D'Andrea, north of the city of Adigrat, important survey work by Peter Schmidt and Matt Curtis, American archaeologists who in the 1990s surveyed the Asmara Plateau. And more recently, a French team shown here in yellow and a German team have also done archaeological survey work. But this gives you a sense that much of this region hasn't been very well explored by archaeologists. So there's many sites that remain to be discovered and much that still remains to be learned about these important early civilizations. This image gives you a sense of the chronology here. This is based on excavations of Beta Georgis, which is part of the capital city of Aksum, and a statistical analysis of radiocarbon dates yields the following timeline of pre-Aksumite and Aksumite civilization. So we know that, of course, Ethiopia is home to some of the earliest Homo sapiens in the world and a really important archaeological record of early, middle, and late Stone Age archaeological sites. And this leads us eventually into the pre-Aksumite period of the first millennium BC. We know recent work that's in the process of being published will push these dates back to the second millennium BC, in which recent work has pushed those dates a little bit earlier. Then we get into the Proto-Aksumite period, which centers around the city of Aksum, and then the early classic, middle, late, and post-Aksumite periods, in which Aksum really expands its reach and interactions across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea into the Mediterranean, is interacting with ancient Greek, Roman, and Egyptian civilizations, and really one of the most influential civilizations of the early centuries AD. This is one of the most important sites for the pre-Aksumite period, the temple at Yeha, that dates back to the 8th century BC, a really impressive monument, one of the oldest standing architecture in sub-Saharan Africa. This was dry-laid stone that depicts a really careful masonry work to get this to be still standing in the way it is. And this really draws on some influences that come out of Arabia and southern Arabia, what is modern-day Yemen. There's long been a debate about the nature of these influences. It was once thought that there was a period of colonization or of setting up of market trade entrepôts in Africa. More recently, scholars have come to understand the interchange of some of the iconography and architecture and religious traditions as being co-opted by African elites who really benefited from integrating some of these new religious traditions, scripts, art styles, and exotic artifacts into the early pre-Aksumite civilization of this region. And this shows you some examples of these. On the left is an incense burner with the insignia of the moon god Al-Makka. So you see the full moon and crescent moon depicted here, along with an ancient South Arabian script inscription. And indeed, the temple at Yeha is dedicated to this patron god of the kingdom of Saba, Al-Makka. Inscription shown here, as well as an ibex frieze that would have adorned the upper wall of this temple, most likely now is incorporated into the wall of a modern church. But it's thought that the ancient kingdom or civilization of Damat here was perhaps had its capital at Yeha, and this was an important center point of the earliest urban and literate civilizations of South Sub-Saharan Africa. This leads us into the kingdom and later empire of Aksum, in which the interconnections and the population density just expanded dramatically, in which we have a vast repertoire of cities, towns, villages, hamlets that spread across the northern highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea. And eventually Aksum comes to dominate parts of Arabia, the southwest corner of Arabia, and also parts of Sudan. Aksum is well known for these famous and impressive stelae shown on the left here that surmount important royal tombs that are depicted at the bottom. a really impressive repertoire of artifacts and art. So glass was once thought, as the example here, to be imported from the Mediterranean, but we know from Beta Samati, as I'll mention shortly, and also from the work of Professor Teklahagos around the city of Aksum, that glass was also being produced in Aksum, as well as were a variety of coins through time. This is a gold coin from the 6th century AD of King Caleb, and a vast array of different types of local pottery. This is a classic Aksumite vessel shown here. So a lot of this archaeological evidence is quite recognizable after more than a century of archaeological work devoted to this early civilization. One of the sites that's really important on the outskirts of the capital city of Aksum is called Dungur, was excavated by a French archaeologist, Francis Amphorae, in 1966 to 1968. And this is thought to have been an elite residential compound near the capital city. No inscriptions were found at the site, but pottery, coins, and architecture place this compound in the late Aksumite period, and gives us a sense of the grandeur and the impressive nature of elite architecture during the late Aksumite period. This is an image map, a topographic map depicting the terrain. And what's interesting about Aksum, it being located roughly 180 kilometers inland, is that even though this civilization controlled much of the trade going in the western part of the Indian Ocean and up the Red Sea, it was very far inland. Perhaps part of that is dominating trade routes coming out of the interior of Africa and from these highland areas down into the Red Sea and eventually up into the Mediterranean. We know some important historical documents give us critical information, including the Periplus of the Rithrian Sea. This is a 1st century AD merchant's guide. It was written in Greek, and it basically is a travel guide or a trade guide for the Red Sea, talking about the different ports that a merchant could stop at, what could be traded, where one could find anchorage down the Red Sea. And one of the important ports here was Adulis in what's modern day Eritrea. And this was the center point of the network that connected Aksum to the rest of the Red Sea and Mediterranean world. The Periplus recounts a journey of 8 days from Adulis and mentions a number of sites. We think, based on archaeological evidence, that one of those sites mentioned is Kaito, and that the route from Adulis would have passed through this archaeological site. And this image shows some computer modeling, some GIS modeling that I'd published in a paper in 2014 with Catherine D'Andrea. We calculated the least costly route based on terrain from Adulis to Aksum. So if you wanted to walk in the most efficient way possible, avoiding steep slopes and difficult terrain, the GIS modeling tells us that it would be about a 41-hour journey. So 5 hours of walking per day for 8 days would cover the 175 kilometers shown here. We don't know precisely the route, and presumably people didn't necessarily take the least costly route solely considering terrain, but rather were stopping at some of these other important archaeological sites and towns, Matara, Sabea, Onaadi, and of course Yeha, before making their way to Aksum. These higher elevation areas depicted in white and gray would have been important because of the greater agricultural potential, greater population densities, and consequently opportunities for trade. But it's interestingly a possibility here to compare these ancient texts with some of the modern technologies to get a sense of the different similarities and differences in the results that are yielded. Now, we have no idea what these are. Mysterious feline body, human head figurines. So if any of you are out there have any idea, you can probably quickly jump on YouTube in the comments section and let us all know if you see anything familiar here. I'm not much of an art historian, but I can sort of think I recognize something here, which is, of course, the Sphinx. Yeah, that's it, the Sphinx. Of course, these aren't as grand as the most famous example in ancient Egypt, but they do depict in an interesting and hopefully entertaining way the connections that are going on here. And we know that ancient Egyptians, back even in the 3rd millennium BC, were launching trade expeditions that picked up to higher and higher ebb down the Red Sea into the land they referred to as Punt. And consequently, lots of interaction was going on through this time. This Sphinx example on the left here is from the Pre-Aksumite period, and the one on the right, slightly later, during the first few centuries AD, found in Yemen. These are published by Francis Amphorae and Andrea Manzo on the left, and Fleischer and Schultz, the one in Yemen, on the right. That gives us a sense of, we're not dealing with a civilization that is independent and isolated, but rather is part of a phenomenon of ancient globalization, in which there's lots of interchange and interconnections between the developments here. We see this further, for example, in the period of the Aksumite king Ezana in the 4th century AD. And one of the most famous artifacts here is called the Ezana stone. In fact, there's 2 Ezana stones, one that's been known for many centuries, and the other discovered in the early 1980s by farmers in a field, and that's the one shown here. So, like Egypt has a very famous trilingual inscription that I'm sure almost all of you have heard about, the Rosetta Stone, Aksum also has important trilingual inscriptions, and including these 2 that in this case are written in Greek, ancient South Arabian or Sabaean language, and Ge'ez, which is the liturgical language of the modern Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So just like the Rosetta Stone was quite pivotal, this really also gives us a window into the internationalization and globalization of this early civilization. This inscription proclaims King Ezana's rule over a vast area, including parts of Yemen, and his victory over the Beja people of what is present-day Eritrea, Sudan, and southeastern Egypt. He credits the god Mahram, as this god is known in Ge'ez and ancient South Arabian. You might be more familiar with the Greek name of this god, Ares, the Greek god of war, and he credits that god for his victories in battle. Importantly, King Ezana, as I'll mention a little bit more later, was also the king who converted the kingdom of Aksum to Christianity in the early 4th century AD. And indeed, Aksum is one of the earliest civilizations to adopt Christianity. And really, this is an important point of understanding the religious change going on in the ancient world from a polytheistic religion, religious traditions in which a pantheon of different gods were worshipped, to Christian traditions. And then, of course, Ethiopia and Aksumite civilization ties in an important way to the early history of Islam and the world's earliest Muslims, which I'll also mention about shortly. So my team's work, the Southern Red Sea Archaeological Histories project, started in 2009 after some very important collaborations with my mentor, Kathy D'Andrea, working around the modern city of Adigrat, conducting survey. I got very interested in the role of water in Aksumite civilization, especially because Yeha has thought for a long period of time to be a center point of irrigation systems and water. And scholars had argued that the introduction of South Arabian irrigation systems was important in the rise of pre-Aksumite civilization. This led us to secure a grant from NASA to do a satellite imagery and archaeological survey-based study of the role of water in Aksumite civilization. And this is on the bottom right here. Dr. Jacob Bonger is formerly of UCLA, now of the University of East Anglia, involved in this archaeological survey work in this very picturesque, rugged landscape in which we're very fortunate to get to explore. Our work, some of which is shown here in this map that depicts evapotranspiration from satellite imagery, from the really important work of Martha Anderson of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, looked at water resources and water flow in relation to the settlements, towns, villages, hamlets that are spread across this region around Yeha. And you see Yeha down in the bottom left corner of this map, and Beta Samati more towards the top. So in addition to this archaeological survey work, in which we're picking up small pieces of artifacts, pottery, and as shown here, an obsidian microlith or a small stone tool, we were also interviewing local peoples, getting a sense of the agricultural practices, water management practices, and how these reach back into the past to inform our understanding of ancient civilizations. And in these interviews, a number of elderly people in the village started to point us towards some important historical sites, including the town of Beta Samati. So after the second or third gentleman in the village said, yeah, you should really go out and see Beta Samati, we thought, heck, we really better spend some time finding our way to this place and see what's there. And this is the large hill or tell in the upper part of this picture that is near the modern town of Ndagaruba. Ndagaruba literally in local Tigrinya language means Wednesday market. And there's a very lively market day there with camels and cattle and chickens and basketry and pottery. And if you ever get a chance to visit Ethiopia, I really encourage you to go see Aksum, Yeha, and visit these type of Ethiopian markets. So the local people really understood this as an important historic site. And we were fortunate to get the opportunity to add an archaeologist's eye to the picture here and gain some deeper understanding of what lies beneath the surface of this important hill or tell, which is really accumulation of material that's deposited over 1,000 years. This is a satellite imagery map showing you the boundary in white. It's about a 20 hectare site. So for my students that don't always recognize what a hectare is, sort of an obscure unit of measure to the general public, sometimes I describe this as being 40 American football fields. So if a American football field is 100 yards long and 50 yards wide, for those of you who are devotees of American sports, that's about a half a hectare. So 2 football fields is a hectare. So this would be about 40 American football fields. Importantly, our work has just really scratched the surface or scratched just beneath the surface of the important town of Beta Samati in 2 places, Area A up on the top of the hill and Area B down towards the base of the hill that I'll be mentioning, and gives us a small window. We refer to this in a conservative way as a town, but we really don't know the population density we're dealing with, seeing so we have just a very preliminary sense of the density here, but really you might be talking about, by ancient standards, a small city or a large town that was ancillary to the capital city of Aksum and plays an important role, as we'll see in a moment or two. Beta Samati here, we first started our excavations in 2011 with Jacob Bongers, as you see here. We recognize the importance of this site based on pottery in the surface and the stone debris, these kinds of debris fields from the stone architecture that's typical of Aksumite sites is quite recognizable on the surface, but we really didn't know what was beneath the surface in store for us until we dug this small test trench that's 2 by 6 meters. And I looked down when we started to open this up and said, Jacob, X marks the spot. X always marks the spot, right? So we were excited to find that fairly shallowly beneath the surface, you could find well-preserved architecture. This is an image from the 3D GIS technologies that we've been using. These red dots denote different artifacts, coins, radiocarbon dates, and other materials that we have been finding. And this image really also I commonly use to explain the interpretation of architecture to my students, because we can get a good sense from this stone architecture of the relative timing of these different walls. So wall A clearly has been constructed first because these other 2 walls, B and C, abut up against it. So you've got wall A, then you've got wall B that comes up and is built against abutting wall A, and then eventually wall C that's abutting both B and A. And then from a radiocarbon date underneath in the wall trench of wall B, we know that these walls date to the 6th and perhaps early 7th century AD, the latter part of the occupation of Beta Samati. We expanded these excavations out into a wider area of Area A, and we know that this area is a residential and workshop complex. These blue and yellow and green lines here of wall A, B, C that I just showed you a moment ago are depicted on this larger 10 by 10 excavation here in our 3D modeling. Interestingly, we discovered that wall A is in fact a network of walls constructed simultaneously that's part of a planned layout constructed at one time. So this wasn't one person's house, but was rather something that encloses a number of different spaces and rooms that were used for activities include metal and glass working, food storage, processing, and consumption of food. One of the things discovered in here is a mogogo griddle. And if any of you have had the fortunate opportunity to enjoy Ethiopian food, you know that injera, this flat pancake-like bread, is a center point of Ethiopian cuisine. And this bread is made on a griddle called a mogogo. So this really ties into what we know about food consumption. And also coins become really important in our interpretation of the site, and including Area A. This is one of the coins coming out of Area A from Aksumite King Ezana, who I mentioned earlier. The motto is written in Greek, Basilica Ezana, or King Ezana. And we know this is a coin coming from the time just before Ezana converted Aksum to Christianity, because of at the top of this coin, there's a crescent moon shape that's depicting the South Arabian god Al-Makka. And after Ezana converts to Christianity, this crescent moon insignia is replaced by a Christian cross. So we know in terms of the coinage, at least, that this is the early 4th century AD, and indeed makes Aksum one of the earliest civilizations to convert to Christianity in the world. Other coins coming out of Area A include not only this King Ezana coin shown here on the left, but also coins from the 5th century AD. Some of the different kings involved here are anonymous. Importantly, for historical purposes and world religions, is the coins of King Arma in the early 7th century AD. So this is a period of time when some of the earliest Muslims in the world, followers of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, were fleeing persecution in Arabia and were given refuge by the king of Aksum. Islamic historical sources don't mention the specific name of the king of Aksum, but it's widely believed that King Arma may have very well been that king. These are coins of King Arma, and during the first Hijra, when these early Muslims fled, they were given refuge and safety in Aksum. And it's very possible that on their journey across the Red Sea and up into the highlands of Ethiopia to Aksum, that they may have stopped at an important town like Beta Samati and may have interacted with people there. Of course, we don't have any verification of that, but there's some important tie-ins not only to Christianity here, but also to the early history of Islam that make this region and Aksumite civilization quite important from a religious perspective. So Area A that I mentioned was followed on by our investigations of an Area B that's closer to the bottom of the hill. And we were pointed to this area by local peoples who had reason to believe that there was some important discoveries to be made in this location. So our first excavations here included a large trench in which we discovered monumental architecture. This wall's over 1 meter thick. It's typical of Middle and Late Aksumite architecture, including similar to what we would find at Dungur at the capital city of Aksum. Goes down about 3 meters. You see at the bottom here a wall trench filled with rubble on which this wall is built. And these are very diligent workers who were involved in these excavations here. At first, we didn't know. We knew we had a monumental building, but we didn't know whether we were looking at a temple, a palace, a church, perhaps even an early mosque if it was at the very, very early end of, or even in the post-Aksumite period. We didn't quite know what we had found. And our early efforts to publish this work were met by reviewers who said, well, you have to figure out what this building is. We had discovered some really important artifacts, including, as I mentioned, I'll mention later, some gold, but we didn't know quite what we were dealing with. The mystery really was solved by expanding our excavations to a larger area of Area B. And one of the critically important artifacts was this discovery, a Gez inscription on a small stone. This has been translated and published by Alessandro Bassi of the University of Hamburg. And this inscription reads in Gez, "To this entrance or atrium, Christ be favorable to us." So it literally is saying, let Christ bless this entrance, essentially, or bless this building. And this really points towards this being a church or a basilica, of course, and rules out a lot of the other possibilities that we'd earlier on been considering, as well as our expanded excavations here, of course, revealed a tripartite building that's typical of basilica plans. So this basilica with a rectangular tripartite Syriac indented plan measures about 18 by 12 meters, and it's characterized by exterior recessed or rebedded walls, projecting corners that are typical of the Aksumite Christian tradition. The layout is quite similar to Middle and Late Aksumite basilicas, although the rectangular apsidal sanctuary suggests an earlier date. Well, later you get an apsidal sanctuary, and in this case we have a rectangular sanctuary, which points to quite an early age. And indeed, radiocarbon dates support this observation and lead us to understand this as being constructed in the 4th century AD, right in the very early era when King Ezana was converting the empire to Christianity. And in addition to the inscription and the layout of this basilica, we also find a paraphernalia associated with early Christian traditions, different crosses, bronze cross and ivory cross pendant, quite a number of incense burners with crosses inscribed, depicting the early practices involved in Christianity here. And we know that this early basilica, so basilicas in the Mediterranean being used not only for Christian religious traditions, but even prior to that being used as administrative buildings and administrative centers. This basilica was tapped into long distance trade in which Amphorae were coming. This is Amphorae that we know are produced in the town of Aqaba and what's modern day Jordan, as well as African red slip terra sigillata, shown here a millefiori glass bead and a wheel thrown jar or perhaps dolium that would have been a large storage jar. So we know important trade goods are coming down the Red Sea, and that this town and basilica, the people worshiping at this basilica had access to these important trade goods. So this amphora depicted a little bit more closely here, we find lots and lots of fragments in a very high numbers, even higher numbers than we find at the capital city of Aksum, suggesting that the density of these amphora here are telling us that this was a well internationally connected site here that was tied into a lot of the activity that was going on in the Mediterranean. This is an example of what we've been looking at in terms of a complete vessel. So these are typical of amphora that are moving around the Mediterranean, carrying things like olive oil and perhaps wine. We don't know exactly what the amphora coming into the Aksumite Empire are carrying, but wine is certainly one likely possibility. Which brings us to another really exciting discovery. One of our most exciting discoveries. Doesn't look like much when you look at it. My students were a little bit disappointed to find this small pink piece of trash in our excavations. But as archaeologists are trained, one person's trash is another person's treasure. And I was really excited to find this little pink piece of trash. Now, I must admit, after many years of field work, I've drank a lot of coffee and I've eaten a lot of biscuits. And the proof of that is in my waistline. But what I didn't realize is that it wasn't just the conversations with local peoples I was engaged in, drinking coffee and eating biscuits, but this was part of my research because I recognized these biscuits. This wasn't just any old piece of trash. These were strawberry hip hop biscuits. And I couldn't find a picture on the internet of the strawberry flavor, but here is the mint cream hip hop biscuits. And I knew what these were. So I was quite excited, even if my students and our team excavating wasn't quite so excited about this important discovery. And it's what was really interesting here on closer examination of this find was the fact that these hip hop biscuits have a date of production and an expiry date on them. So not only did we know that there was some disturbance going on around our basilica, some illicit digging, but we were happy to confirm that this illicit digging happened well before we got there. And part of the observations that were made by local farmers was perhaps a function of the fact that they'd been doing some digging before we had arrived there and had left behind some of the strawberry hip hop biscuits. So even if you find something that seems like it's not an important discovery, it turns out this did give us some more important information about activities going on at the site in recent times.
But more seriously, our work has also involved public outreach to educate and encourage government officials and local peoples to protect and preserve archaeological and cultural heritage resources. With the tragic recent conflict in Ethiopia, we've seen purposeful damage to places of deep cultural importance, and we've been urging both Ethiopians and the international community not only to protect heritage sites, but first and foremost to address the horrific humanitarian conditions people in this region are currently facing, including lack of food, water, and medical care.
In addition, around this basilica, we have a vast array of ceramic figurines, zoomorphic figurines and anthropomorphic figurines, so figurines of animals and figurines of people, and sometimes figurines like this upper left example here that are of a sort of a humanoid face and an animal, so bull horns here and a human face. So these ceramic bull's heads we know date back to the Pre-Aksumite period, where many of these are collected in ceramic and stone by Peter Schmidt and Matt Curtis and their team working in Eritrea. We don't know quite what these bull's heads are used for, perhaps in some sort of ritual or trade. We also find these ceramic tokens or ceramic objects. Early on, some people had speculated these are involved with weaving, but they don't seem to be spindle whorls. They're not very symmetrical. They're of all sorts of different conical, triangular, and cross-shaped sizes. We still ponder what these are related to. They've been being found in amongst Aksumite sites for over 100 years. Our best understanding of them is as tokens that had something to do with trade or other administrative activities, and perhaps they were strung out on a string. But in addition to these early Christian artifacts, this basilica tells us a lot and has potential to yield even more information about the interface of the polytheistic and Christian religious traditions. So there's an interesting mixing going on here of the early Pre-Aksumite traditions with the Christian traditions around the inside and around the outside of this basilica that we're interested in further investigating. Another one of the really important artifacts we found here was a soft stone pendant. This is about 5 centimeters or so high, and it's got a hole running through it that would have been strung and perhaps hung around somebody's neck. The inscription here in Giz has been studied by Alessandro Bassi. And so you see a Christian cross here on the left-hand side, and then a number of letters that we spent a lot of time contacting different people about and pondering. And Alessandro Bassi did a wonderful job of examining and interpreting these letters in his recent publication. These are Giz, and the transcription and transliteration is shown here. Essentially, these letters are written in a radial fashion and are depicting this message of venerable cross, or an honorary, making a statement about early Christianity. And some of the comparanda of here that Alessandro Bassi recognized are manuscripts from a monastery nearby this region. that have a similar pattern of letters, suggesting that this phrase was quite important in early Christian traditions. Another important discovery from this basilica that came in our early excavations was this gold intaglio ring that's been conserved and worked on by Christy Pohl. And this really is a wonderful example of the international connections in which the form and basic style of this ring is quite reminiscent to rings of the Roman Empire, but incorporate the iconography of a much more African tradition. And indeed, the bull and vine motif is one that we see associated with the South Arabian god Al-Makka, but is incorporated here in a carnelian intaglio ring that was discovered right below the stone paved floor in our basilica, and combines this copper alloy with gold foil covering on the bezel and an electrum band. And this intaglio is carved with this image of a bull's head and vine. And we know from a nearby radiocarbon date, this probably dates to the 6th or early 7th century AD, and is one of the really interesting examples that ties into Aksumite civilization. So in terms of a summary here, I'll finish off with some concluding remarks that highlight the importance of our discoveries. Beta Samati was a major center about an hour-and-a-half walk from Yeha, where activity concentrated between the 8th century BC and the 7th century AD. We know that Beta Samati was an important node of authority ancillary to the capital city that had privileged access to luxuries traded over long distances. So it was not only the capital city that was tied into this network of trade routes, but Beta Samati as well was involved in this early internationalization. The basilica at Beta Samati was used from the 4th to the 7th century AD, making it one of the earliest in sub-Saharan Africa. So in addition to the textual records that recount Ezana's conversion to Christianity, this archaeological evidence is quite important. We know there's other basilicas dating from the 5th, 6th, 7th century, but none that have been recently excavated. Most of the ones that we know were excavated a long, long time ago, and especially a basilica from the 4th century is very rare and very important. The basilica shows a complex blurring of trade and administrative activities, tokens, stamp seals, and pagan rituals depicted in these figurines and bull's head token objects, as well as Christian traditions like incense burners and crosses. So this is really important for our understanding of early religious traditions and how those traditions changed through time, not only at the capital city amongst the elites and royalty, but also amongst the other peoples of the Empire of Aksum, and how they become adopted at smaller towns and villages. We're very troubled by the recent violent conflict in Ethiopia and the humanitarian crisis. So I encourage you, if you're not familiar with the conflict that's been going on in the past couple of months, to become more aware. It's really, our heart goes out to people in Tigray and to Ethiopia who are suffering from this crisis, and we hope peace will return as soon as possible to this region. In early 2020, Yeha was named onto the tentative list as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we really hope that archaeology and heritage can play an important role in peace and reconciliation in this region. So rather than focusing in on the recent very heated conflict in this area, we really see archaeology and heritage as a window for peacemaking and cooperation. And the people of Ndagaruba are really an example of that, of Muslims and Christians working cooperatively on the construction of mosques and churches, on farming, and really as part of our excavations. This is an image of our team and the many very hospitable and gracious hosts that we've had in guiding us through this landscape and helping us understand the history of Ethiopia. Important individuals here include Ioana Dumitru, shown here in this picture, who is one of the co-directors, and Kifle Zeru of Aksum University, who played a big role in the excavations of this site. I'd also like to thank the Authority for Research and Conservation of Cultural Heritage and the Tigray Culture and Tourism Bureau, as well as Afeiram Wareda in the village of Ndagaruba, UCLA, National Geographic, the Archaeological Institute of America, Aksum University, Johns Hopkins University, my home university, and all the great number of people who've supported our research throughout the years. Well, thank you very much to the University of Chicago Oriental Institute for the opportunity to present on the archaeology of Ethiopia and our work on the discovery and excavations of the ancient town of Beta Samati. I'd be glad to be in touch with any of you who have questions. Please do find my email on Johns Hopkins website. I'd be glad to be in touch and communicate with you. And thank you for your time and attention.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.